together a couple of things here just to kind of go through what is currently happening in terms of sheltering. So as everybody knows, we at Social Services administer OTDA programs locally, which include providing sheltering for people who are homeless. Social Services contracts with St. John's Community Services to provide shelter services in Tompkins County. Just to make a quick distinction, we are always very willing and seek to do outreach with people who are in the encampment. But beyond providing outreach, we don't have a way to serve people unless they seek services through us. So just to be clear about that, some people sometimes want to know, why doesn't Social Services go out and make somebody engage with services, and we don't have a way to do that. So the two primary services that we have around homeless services are temporary housing assistance and code blue sheltering. THA is available year-round, provides supports for employment, treatment of various sorts, funding for permanent housing, and has compliance requirements to qualify. Code blue sheltering was put in place back in 2016 by an emergency order by the governor to provide sheltering for people when the temperature is 32 degrees or below with wind chill. And while we always try to provide as many supports as we can to people, Code Blue sheltering does not provide funding that supports permanent housing or other supports that are often needed. So it's really got some limitations. This next slide is a snapshot of the number of people in shelter over the past few years. Shelter numbers have varied significantly over time, and the past few years, especially because of the pandemic. The pandemic, I think, when we look at kind of the way it's impacted things and then the response to the pandemic, have significantly impacted sheltering. So things like the ERAP, or the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that the state put out, significantly altered shelter numbers. We saw people that became unemployed in the beginning of the pandemic, or lost housing in the beginning of the pandemic, then were sheltered. Then the ERAP program came out, and that provided supports for people. So shelter numbers dropped. So there's a lot of factors, and it's a little bit hard to look at the data for all of those for those issues recently. The impacts more recently of the labor shortage and the kinds of sheltering and the kinds of supports that we've been able to be provided due to those issues have also impacted shelter significantly. This next slide shows us the daily average census of people in the shelter. And as I indicated before, many things impact the census over time. But you can see generally that numbers are rising, and our numbers in January were the highest that we've ever seen. Currently, as an example, this week, even though we are well away from Code Blue sheltering, we have a total of 84 people in shelter. There are 68 adults in shelter and 16 children. So we've got 7 households in shelter, which is, not that long ago, we didn't see households, we didn't see families, except for very rarely, and now that's a regular trend. This slide, we see that people are staying longer in shelter than they ever have been before. In September of 2022, we had 30% of people that were staying in shelter longer than 90 days. And in January of this year, 54% of the people were in shelter longer than 90 days. So we're seeing that number increase pretty significantly over time. So what's happening that may be increasing stays? This slide references some older numbers, but one of the factors that we're seeing, like I said, is the demographics of the shelter population are changing. We are seeing more families, we're seeing more women, more couples, single fathers who have children. All of those populations are beginning to seek shelter in a way that we just hadn't seen previously.
Kit,
so it's.
May I ask a question? It's hard to see on the screens that we're looking at. Could you tell us what the colored bar lines represent? So we.
Sure, and I can send this out afterwards. So the, let's see, the bright blue are our families. The gray are the single adults. The dark gray up here are single males. And then it's green, which I think actually the color at the bottom is hard to even tell that it's the green, but green are single females.
Thank you.
So you can, this is January 22 and this is January 21. So you can see even in a 1 year time, you can see how those numbers have really changed over time. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Kit.
Sure. So, so this next slide, we are seeing, like I said, we are seeing persons and families with, well, I didn't say this before, sorry. We're beginning to see people and families with much more intensity of need and more complexity of need. And this is a trend with the shelter population. It's also a trend across all of what social services is seeing. All of our programs are experiencing families that have complexity of need and intensity of need. So what do I mean by that? Many families today have complex needs that may encompass things like multiple service need areas. It's not uncommon to work with a family that needs shelter, but they may also have mental health issues, substance abuse problems, domestic violence within the family, child welfare concerns, health or chronic health needs, and or developmental disabilities. And it's not uncommon that families will have, multiple needs in these areas, or that they have very immediate needs. They've needed services for a while, and those haven't been available, and they come to us in crisis. This is true, I'm referring here to families, but it's true as well with individuals. We see people in shelter that historically we would have seen going to other programs or getting other kinds of treatment that are ending up in the shelter system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We're finding at the same time throughout the pandemic that many beds for things like mental health and substance abuse treatment, children's services of various kinds, anything from detention to mental health crisis for children, developmental disability service provisions were either closed temporarily or permanently during the pandemic. And while we've experienced that some are beginning to open again post-pandemic, many are not. And those that are not are often, they're slow to return if they are returning, and that's due to the labor shortage. So we're seeing, again, there are multiple factors coming together. During the pandemic, things were closed down due to safety and COVID protocols. But getting things back open has been a real challenge because programs just can't hire staff to provide service provision. And some beds have been closed permanently by the state. The shelter staff now are regularly providing services to people that have many of the chronic conditions, or that treatment, would usually inpatient treatment would have usually been sought for, but just isn't available, or people aren't voluntarily choosing those. So we're really seeing as a result an increase in challenging behaviors and risks associated with sheltering. And because this is very small text, I will say this is a quick outline of some shelter incidents between January 22 and 23. We had 12 physical altercations and assaults, 8 mental health crises, 6 overdoses, 6 verbal aggressions or threats. And these are significant events. These aren't simple day-to-day kinds of things. 5 medical emergencies, 3 overdose deaths, 2 incidents with a weapon, 1 sexual assault, and 1 death of natural causes. What I will say here is that this is only reporting the serious incidents that occurred on site at the shelter. All of the other locations where sheltering, is provided, the hotel, in congregate settings, any of those are reported outside the state system, so we don't have a good way to track those. So this is a very small snapshot of the kind of things that we are seeing pretty regularly now in shelter. So we are seeing increasingly, like I said, significant risk and significant challenging behaviors. We're really seeing particularly aggression directed at other clients and staff at the shelter or the hotel. We're also seeing significant destruction of shelter or hotel property, mental health crises, overdoses, and medical emergencies. All of these difficulties result in greater need for services and a significant increase in difficulty finding persons that are sheltered a place to be permanently housed. The other challenge with sheltering is the change in community services. And I want to be careful when I talk about this because I don't want in any way to sound critical of our local resources. We partner with almost everybody in the community, and we respect and rely on everyone. But we have seen a change, I think, in the way that services are carried out. So to give an example, changes that are legislative, like bail reform, have really changed the whole service delivery in our community that we rely on. So police take longer to respond. And even when serious issues like physical aggression occur at the shelter, even when somebody is arrested, they're often not removed, rarely incarcerated. And while nobody wants anybody who needs services to be incarcerated, that process historically has been used as a way for somebody to connect with inpatient or other service provision. And oftentimes we're left without a mechanism now for that. So mental health crisis services are also very limited in our community, as is the case in many communities. I'm hopeful we'll see increased services in the future, but it's not uncommon that at the shelter, hotel, and social services has really few options for people who are in crisis. Our local hospital has limited resources these days. Again, many factors go into that, changes in the way that they are operating, labor shortage, all of those things come into play. It's not uncommon for somebody to overdose at the shelter, sometimes multiple times, and to be returned to the shelter. Or for people who have significant health issues to be discharged to the shelter from the hospital. So what does this mean for sheltering in our community? Providing sheltering services is much more complex, and the array of needs is higher. The volume of those that need shelter is greater, and the services that we have to offer to clients and the support of the work of the shelter and the social services has declined significantly. So as we look at the complexity of needs that sheltered people have these days, it's not hard to understand why the challenges of using a housing first model and finding permanent housing are also extremely difficult. While social services is always hopeful that we might at some point see increased benefits for those that seek permanent housing, it's still very challenging for people who receive funding through social services to find housing in our community at our cost points. As outlined here, we have a number of great housing support programs that can help, and we use these on a regular basis to really supplement and support people. That said, all of the complexities of need that encompass things like mental health, substance abuse, and many other social issues make finding and keeping housing extremely difficult for those that are sheltered. It's not uncommon that we assist somebody in finding permanent housing only to have them lose it because they're aggressive or destructive, or for some other reason are just not ready to be permanently housed without staff or without supports. So as we move into the future, we as a county may need to take all of this into consideration in making some decisions around critical issues that involve size and need of shelter and our continued efforts at providing housing that will serve the people that are most in need in our community. So that's my report at this point. I can certainly answer any questions that might come up.
Appreciate it, Kit. I will look to my colleagues if they have any questions. I see Mike's hand.
I'm just wondering, Kit, what kind of impact do you expect, with the new mental health facility going in up at the mall and the new ADC, going in? That seems to address two of your primary problems, not completely, obviously, but some, it's a start anyway.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about that, Mike, and I think that I'm very optimistic. I will say that, The challenge that we are going to see, I think, is we will have, with increased supports around from both of those places, we will see hopefully more supports around the immediate crisis when somebody has a mental health challenge. I think we continue to be left with real challenges around finding inpatient treatment for people and finding long-term solutions for people that have chronic mental health problems. It is really a challenge to find a place where people can be treated long enough that they really are stabilized and not return to the shelter where they tend to not do so well because of that environment. And it is a real challenge to find housing with enough support that can support somebody who really has a chronic need. So, we have lots of supportive housing. Well, we have lots of low-income housing, but many of the people that rely on social services funding really require an extremely low-income housing, which we don't have a lot of. And then the second challenge is that we have very little housing that provides staff on site with the intensity that's needed to support people that have really chronic and intense problems.
Any other questions, Mike?
It's a bigger question, though. It's more like, listen, I'm not suggesting we bring back the hospitals of the 1970s, but is there a place for hospitalization of some people with the eventuality that they would be, put back into society, they would rejoin society? But it would seem that under a hospital model, we would be able to get Medicaid funding or Medicare funding. I mean, you would get these different revenue sources if it was in a hospital setting. Or is that not true? I know it's a really big question. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. You don't have to answer any of that, but it's just kind of thinking about it.
It's a good question, Mike. What I would say is that legislatively, that's not the direction that things are typically going in. And the second thing, in terms of people being hospitalized in a long-term or institutional way. And then the second thing I would say is that currently I think that there is that there have been increased limits on what can be paid for in terms of really long-term programs, unless, with the exception of very specific populations and needs. So.
Thanks. I didn't mean to spring that on you. It's
it's okay.
More of a societal kind of problem.
Ann Corman.
Thanks. Thanks for the report, Kit. So a couple of things, just going off what Mike had just said too. Having worked in inpatient mental health and drug addiction and various things like that. Short term sounds, to me like we need more of, and I think that's maybe what you were referring to, right? Short term, if they need short term treatment or hospitalization and or maybe intensive outpatient. Is that what you were talking about?
I think there are two issues. One is that I think we need probably more inpatient options. And the second thing is that we need a plan for aftercare. One of the challenges for this population is that we really don't have, so if you take somebody, let's use substance abuse because it's a little clearer. You take somebody with a really intense substance abuse problem. Sorry, my office lights just turned off. You take somebody with a really intense substance abuse problem and they are hospitalized. If you can find inpatient treatment for them, they go in to an inpatient setting and they maybe stay 30 days. When they come out, if there is no program where there's staffing and support, they go back into the shelter and pretty quickly they're using again, typically. I'm not saying there aren't people that, are able to manage that, but a lot of times the risks and the chaos of being in a shelter and being in that kind of situation mean that somebody starts to use again and you've lost ground again. So I think we need an aftercare plan that we don't have right now, if that's a way to describe it.
Sure. Where I worked in inpatient was in Elmira for one of the places, and it was very hard to, if you didn't, I was the discharge planner, and if you don't have all those things, you're sending somebody out and they would unfortunately recycle back. And you mentioned about, we got a lot of people who had been incarcerated or into the legal system, and you mentioned, and they'd get in quite quickly and also have this leverage, whether you say it's good or bad, but they had the leverage was you do this program or you go back to possibly incarceration. So you mentioned that, does that not having people be, say, arrested or incarcerated, is that make it harder for them to get some services?
So again, I'm going to use the example of substance abuse. Historically, what has happened, I'm not in any way saying I endorse this model because I don't think it's the best model, but historically, let's say somebody was homeless and they were using substances, and because they were impaired, they got into an altercation with somebody, they were arrested maybe by the local police, they were put into the local jail, and then we have had a model where we have had a staff person that could go work with that person, do a substance abuse assessment, and work with that person to find inpatient treatment. Once somebody's been in jail for a couple of days, they're no longer using substances, it is not as difficult to have them engage at that point and say, yeah, I'm willing to go into treatment. That process is really broken down. So that was oftentimes jail was a vector to treatment. Again, not the vector I'd like to see, but it was a mechanism. So what's happened now is we really don't incarcerate. Again, I would rather people not be incarcerated that need help, but we really don't have another option. The only option we have right now is we ask people when they're impaired, if they are in an altercation, they might have, the cops were called, the cops come in and arrest them. They're asked voluntarily, would you like to go to treatment? But they're impaired. They say no, and they're back in the shelter. And, we're dealing again with a real struggle around their behaviors and that kind of thing. The other thing that's happening with all of this is people are burning out all the resources. We are quickly, because people are in this state, we have no other mechanism. We are losing options for people very quickly. They hurt somebody at the shelter says they can't be here. We burn out all the hotels say, I'm not taking that person, I can't work with them. And very quickly, we're coming to a crisis point with our sheltering system because we have a population of people that more and more are being refused by everyone. And every county right now is facing that. And we really have no mechanism. And I'm very concerned that when we face our next cold weather, this coming winter, that we're going to end up in a rough spot.
Just one comment, then I will. So just one last comment. You don't have to answer this, but I know you said that it's also complicated by some of the services were closed down by the state. So I'm not asking you to do that because I know we need to move on, but really complex system. And also I just want to make that clear, I am not advocating that let's get people arrested and get them into there. I'm just pointing out that it's a challenge, as you're saying.
Yes.
Kit, I appreciate the thoughtfulness, as always, you put into your presentations. If you wouldn't mind sharing those slides with Taylor here so she can share those and other slides from today with the committee and rest of the legislature, I'd appreciate that. But again, thanks for your time, and I look forward to the continued conversation in terms of trying to find a solution that best fits the needs within Tompkins County.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thanks, Kit.